I arrived at the front gate of the old asylum just as the last traces of sunlight dipped below the hills, leaving the building shrouded in a thick, almost unnatural darkness. This place had been abandoned for over 4 decades, left to decay at the edge of town, but its eerie allure had only grown stronger over the years. Stories floated around about voices echoing in empty halls, doors slamming in deserted rooms, and the feeling of being watched, a perfect backdrop for my latest video. I was no stranger to spooky spots. It was practically my channel's theme at this point. But this place, it felt different. The walls seemed to breathe under a blanket of ivy, the windows staring like dark, hollow eyes. I took a long breath, felt a flicker of apprehension, and pushed it away. After all, my viewers love the suspense, and this place was more than enough to deliver. Setting up the cameras was my first priority. I placed one at the main hall, another down the left wing, and one more by the stairwell. As I moved through the silent corridors, it struck me how the atmosphere seemed to shift with every step. A faint draft whispered through broken windows, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Once my cameras were ready, I turned to my main device, lifted it to my face, and spoke. So, here we are. The old asylum. Local legend says it was built in the early 1900s, back when. I hesitated, almost sensing an audience watching, yet I knew the building was empty. Or at least, it was supposed to be. I cleared my throat and continued. Back when facilities like this weren't exactly humane. Patients, it said, were often confined to these walls for life, and some never left. My voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the dark. Moving deeper into the building, I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Old paintings lined the walls, faces blurred by time, each one bearing an unreadable expression. They seemed to follow me, shadows stretching as I passed. I was nearly to the main staircase when I noticed something wedged between the floorboards, half hidden by dust. A leather-bound book, the edges worn and cracked. I held it up to the camera, brushing the cover free of grime. "Look what we've got here," I whispered. "A diary, maybe? Probably some kid's idea of a joke," but I turned the cover, and as I did, a shiver ran through me. Written in faint pencil strokes on the first page were the words, "To the one who follows my path." With an uncertain smile, I glanced at the camera. Guess I'm not the only one who thought this place was worth a visit. I opened to the first entry, and my fingers brushed over the words as I read silently. It described corridors, the same ones I'd just walked, the steps and turns matching my route. The writer's words were shaky, desperate, and a sense of dread seeped into me as I realized they seemed to predict each of my movements, one by one. I closed the book, my pulse racing. This was coincidence. Had to be. And yet, the feeling of eyes on me grew stronger, the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching to the walls around me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to find nothing but the yawning darkness I'd walked through. And yet, it felt as if something, or someone, lingered just out of sight, waiting for me to look away. I laughed softly to myself, holding the diary up to the camera as though it could somehow answer my questions. Whoever wrote this, they must have really liked horror stories, huh? My voice sounded tinny, reverberating in the vast, empty hall. I carefully turned the page, my fingers stiff, almost unwilling. The words were written in a hurried scrawl, as if the writer had been in a rush, or maybe afraid. They described a narrow staircase, one that led down to the lower levels, a place supposedly off-limits, sealed up when the asylum had closed. I hadn't noticed any stairs like that on my way in. Still, the pull of curiosity was undeniable. "Looks like we've got a lead," I said, half to the camera and half to myself, as though reassuring some invisible audience. I made my way back through the hall, listening to the creak of the floor beneath my feet, the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen, the rustle of what I hoped was just the wind. There was something unsettling about the silence here. It felt too complete, as if every noise was somehow swallowed by the walls. At the end of the hallway, I found the stairs. They spiraled down into darkness, narrower than I'd expected, with walls that seemed to close in the further I descended. I took a shaky breath, holding up the diary to skim the next line. "Down here, the silence is different. It fills your ears, presses into your skull." I swallowed, feeling the weight of the words settle over me. Each step felt like a small surrender, a gradual acceptance that maybe this place wasn't entirely abandoned. The air turned colder, heavier, almost as if it were thick with the memories of those who'd walked these halls long before me. Shadows gathered at the edges of my vision, disappearing when I looked directly at them. I reached the bottom of the stairs and shone my flashlight around, the beam slicing through the dust, casting long, eerie shapes along the walls. To my right was a door, partially ajar, the paint peeling, revealing dark wood underneath. I held my breath, pushing it open with my shoulder. Inside, the room was small and claustrophobic, filled with rows of cabinets and faded medical charts, stacked and forgotten. In the corner was a chair, the leather cracked and crumbling, with thin, faint impressions on the seat, as if someone had sat there recently. My skin prickled. Turning the camera to the diary, I continued reading, my voice barely a whisper. "When you reach the basement, look for the chair. Sit down and close your eyes. You'll feel the walls start to breathe. Don't be afraid." I felt my stomach drop as I read the last line. This is where it started for me. My fingers tightened around the book, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to retrace my steps, pack up the cameras, and forget I ever came here. But something stronger held me in place, an urge to uncover what this stranger had experienced, to see if their story was somehow woven into the fabric of this building. Hesitantly, I crossed the room, each step echoing in the stillness. I looked down at the chair and the faint outline left by an unseen guest, and as I sat, a strange sensation crept over me. The silence grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, breathing in tandem with me. For the first time, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. The room grew darker, and in that moment, I knew this place had been waiting for someone like me, to listen. The room was silent, yet there was a thickness to the air, a sensation that I wasn't entirely alone. I felt the weight of the asylum around me, as though its walls had been anticipating this, biding time until someone like me came along to listen. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the steady hum of the camera beside me. "All right, everyone," I whispered, as though addressing my audience. "We've made it to the basement. I think we're about to find out what our friend here experienced." I held the diary up to the camera again and flipped to the next page, the crumbling paper soft under my fingertips. The ink had faded in places, but I could still make out the faint, trembling words. "If you're here, then you're close. Close to what waits below." My pulse quickened, and I felt a flicker of regret for ever having opened this book. I scanned the room. Dust clung to every surface, and there was an oppressive smell, something stale and earthy, like a place that had been forgotten long ago. My flashlight swept over a row of cabinets to the left, where rusty metal doors hung open, their contents long since pilfered or discarded. But my attention was drawn to a small vent near the floor. It looked like it had been pried open, as though someone had crawled through it to reach something hidden. The diary gave no more clues, but I felt compelled to investigate. I lowered myself onto my hands and knees, peering inside the vent. The space beyond was too dark to see clearly, but a faint draft stirred, carrying with it a cold, damp smell. I crawled forward, flashlight in one hand and camera in the other, my movements slow and careful. As I inched through the narrow passage, the air grew colder, and the walls around me seemed to close in. Panic scratched at the back of my mind, urging me to turn back. But the pull of the unknown, of the mystery that lay just out of reach, was stronger. I pushed on, deeper into the passage, until finally, it opened into a small room. The room was cramped and bare, but in the center was a single, strange object, a metal box, sealed shut and covered in a thick layer of dust. I knelt beside it, wiping the dust away, my fingers leaving smudged marks on the cold metal. I held my breath as I pried it open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. Inside was a bundle of old, brittle pages, each one scrawled with frantic, hurried handwriting. It took me a moment to realize what they were, entries from the same diary I'd found upstairs, as though the writer had hidden the last, most disturbing pages away, never to be read. I started to read, my voice barely above a whisper. I hear footsteps now. They follow me, but when I turn, nothing is there. I can feel it watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to slip, to falter. I fear I will never leave this place. I looked around, half expecting to see something in the dim corners of the room, something waiting in the darkness. But there was only the steady sound of my own breathing, my heart pounding in my ears. The last entry was brief, the words shaky and desperate. If you find this, then it's found you too. Do not look behind you. It's closer than you think. A chill shot through me, and I froze, gripping the diary tightly. I felt a presence then, a weight pressing against my back, something just behind me, silent and waiting. I didn't dare move, didn't dare turn to see what was there. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to count each exhale, as though that would keep me tethered to reality. After a moment, the sensation began to fade, leaving only a lingering cold in the air. I forced myself to stand, clutching the pages, and backed away slowly, never turning my back to the room. The oppressive silence returned, and I felt the walls close in again, a faint whispering in the shadows, urging me to read on. But I didn't. I slipped the diary back into the box, sealing it as though that might contain whatever malevolent force lay within. The passage back to the main corridor felt longer, darker, as if the asylum itself had shifted while I was down there. The air was thick, each breath heavy, and every sound, the rustling of my clothes, the soft clink of my equipment, seemed amplified. It was as though I'd crossed some threshold and the walls around me were attentive. I reached the corridor, and for a moment, I hesitated. There was something deeply wrong here, as if the building had changed its form, folding itself around me. My flashlight beam caught the edges of the peeling walls, the distant frames of doors that seemed to stretch longer, narrowing into blackness. I looked down at the diary in my hands, still clutched tightly, and felt a renewed shiver run through me. I started to read, almost as if compelled. After the basement, I was never alone. There were voices in every hall, whispers that grew louder the further I went. I tried to shut them out, but they were insistent, like a song I couldn't unhear. They told me things, stories about the rooms I passed, each tale more disturbing than the last. The words slipped off the page and into the air around me. It felt like the voices were here with me, watching. The silence of the asylum was no longer empty but alive, filled with a presence that stirred just beneath the surface. My footsteps echoed softly as I continued down the hall, my fingers tracing the walls as though I could anchor myself in the physical world. I looked at my camera, its red recording light blinking steadily, my one tether to the outside world. This place is. It's like it's remembering something, I murmured to the lens, my voice swallowed by the darkness. It's more than just an abandoned building. Ahead, a door creaked open slowly, as if beckoning. I hesitated, gripping the diary tighter. The pages felt strangely warm in my hands, almost pulsing, as though it held some latent energy, an imprint of its writer's mind. The words had been guiding me, drawing me into the depths of the asylum like a trail of breadcrumbs. And now, it seemed, I was being invited further. The door led to a long, narrow room filled with beds, each one covered in dusty sheets. They lay in rows, and in the silence, I could almost see the shadows of people lying there, staring up at the ceiling in quiet despair. I forced myself to move forward, the musty scent of the room clinging to my senses, oppressive and suffocating. I opened the diary again, my eyes scanning the latest entry. This is the ward where they were kept, the ones they couldn't let leave. They say if you listen, you can still hear them calling, begging to be set free. The wind picked up, rattling the window frames, and I heard it then, a faint murmur, a whisper that rose and fell like the ebb and flow of waves. The sound seemed to drift through the beds, a chorus of voices, distant and distorted. My skin prickled, and I swallowed hard, feeling a chill settle deep in my bones. The whispering grew louder, as though the voices were drawn to my presence. They layered over one another, building into a crescendo of desperate, pleading tones. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but the sound seeped through, slipping into my mind, crowding my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my hand pressing against the nearest bed frame for support. The whispers faded, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I opened my eyes to find that I was no longer alone in the room. At the far end, where the shadows thickened, a faint outline stood, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, indistinct, as though the darkness itself had taken shape, watching me with an intensity that made my heart pound. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze heavy and unmoving. I backed away slowly, clutching the diary like a talisman, my mind racing. Whatever was here, it had been waiting. And I was the one who'd come too close, the one who disturbed its slumber. I tried to speak, but my voice came out in a hoarse whisper. Who are you?" There was no response, only the deepening silence and the figure, standing impossibly still, bound to the shadows like it was part of the building itself. I felt the overwhelming urge to flee, to leave this place and never look back. But some curiosity, or perhaps the pull of the diary's final words, held me in place. Then, with a sudden flicker of movement, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the darkness as though it had never been there. And in that moment, I knew this place didn't just hold memories. It held on to people, those who had come too close, who had crossed the line between curiosity and something far more dangerous. I looked down at the diary, the final entry open before me. If you've reached this point, then you're already part of it. You'll never leave this place. None of us ever do. The air felt dense, like trying to breathe underwater. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching me, unseen faces pressing in from all sides. The figure's silent departure left a hollow in the room, but its presence lingered, embedded in the very walls, echoing through every inch of the asylum. I retreated from the row of beds, back to the hallway. My legs were leaden, and I felt as though I were moving through molasses, yet something in the depths of my mind urged me forward. The diary weighed heavy in my hands, its leather cover slightly damp from my palm sweat. I didn't dare put it down. It felt both a curse and a shield, the only thing tying me to the reality of my own investigation. And as I moved, I began to realize the horror of what the final entry had said: "You'll never leave this place." I moved down the hall, stepping carefully, my camera recording every faltering step. The diary pages were almost translucent under the flashlight's beam, the words blurring like shadows, and I had to strain to read the next entry. The hallways seemed to narrow, closing in on me, breathing with their own life. I try to turn back, but every step leads me deeper. The lines of text felt like they were speaking directly to me, yet they seemed written in haste, the ink smudged and frantic. I forced myself to look away, to keep my gaze trained on the corridor in front of me. But every time I glanced up, the hallway stretched longer, its walls bending, curling around me as if herding me toward an inevitable end. I reached a landing where a staircase led up into shadows. I could feel a draft from above, carrying the faint scent of dust and decay. My stomach twisted at the thought of going up, but it was as if some pull beyond my control had taken over, like invisible hands nudging me forward. I couldn't turn back, couldn't force my legs to move in any direction but up. One step, then another, until I was halfway up the stairs, and the sound of footsteps began to echo behind me. A soft, deliberate pace that matched my own. I froze, my skin prickling, and turned to face the landing below. But there was nothing there, only shadows pooling in the corners, silent and watching. I forced myself to breathe, to shake off the dread that crawled up my spine, and I climbed the last few steps. The corridor at the top of the stairs was narrower, more claustrophobic, with doors lining either side like sentinels. My flashlight flickered as I walked, casting fleeting glimpses into empty rooms, each one a hollow cell, bare walls scratched and scarred. The doors, the diary whispered. Once they close, they never open again. An icy chill settled over me, as if I had stepped into a different world, a place cut off from reality. I gripped the diary tighter, the words vibrating in my mind. Each door felt like it was watching me, waiting, as though choosing the right one was a matter of life and a choice with no return. The thought brought a thin bead of sweat to my temple. My pulse was rapid, hammering against my ribs, and I found myself muttering to the empty hallway, "This is just an old hospital, a forgotten relic." But the building seemed to hear me. A door creaked behind me, just barely ajar, swinging open with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. I turned, feeling the weight of the moment sink over me. The room beyond was darker, untouched by my flashlight's reach. Yet something drew me forward, some primal curiosity that mingled with dread, and before I could second-guess myself, I stepped inside. The room was bare, save for a single metal bed in the center, its frame rusted, the mattress torn and sagging. A faint scent of mildew hung in the air, and as my flashlight swept the room, the beam caught something, words scratched into the wall above the bed, letters faint but legible. "Leave while you can." I felt my heart thudding in my chest, a raw panic rising within me. I backed away, stumbling into the hallway. But as I turned, I saw that the corridor had changed, its walls closed in around me. The stairway was gone, replaced by another endless stretch of doors. And the diary's pages, clutched in my hand, fluttered open to a new entry that I hadn't yet seen. When you see the warning, it's already too late. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I was no longer following a path, I was becoming a part of it. I stood in that narrow corridor, the walls close enough to brush my shoulders, the sound of my own breathing amplified as though the asylum itself were mocking my fear. The door that had creaked open behind me seemed to have vanished, and the hallway stretched longer than before, every shadow darker, every corner murkier. The diary lay heavy in my hand, each entry now feeling like a breadcrumb I could barely resist following. For a moment, I leaned against the wall, trying to anchor myself in the present, in reality. But the silence around me held a weight, something nearly tangible, and I felt like I was intruding in a place long abandoned yet fiercely guarded. Every inch of this building felt like it had been shaped, its walls made to imprison memories that refused to decay, memories still clinging to life. I flipped open the diary once more. My fingers trembled as I read the new passage. In these halls, every sound carries, echoing as if the walls themselves are alive. I walk, and I can't shake the feeling of footsteps trailing behind me, yet when I turn, nothing. With every word, the atmosphere thickened. I could feel something just out of sight, pacing quietly, watching from the shadows. I took a tentative step forward, the diary's words looping in my mind, warning me, leading me onward. My footsteps seemed too loud in the silence, and with each one, it felt like something, or someone, was echoing them back. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness slipping out. I hesitated, staring at that opening, feeling drawn toward it. The air was colder now, and I had to squint to see what lay beyond. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with faded tiles covering the floor and a single, broken-down bed pushed against the wall. A window, covered in grime, let in faint slivers of moonlight that pulled across the floor like streaks of silver. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on a set of shelves filled with tattered medical files, a metal basin rusted at the edges, and a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. I moved toward the mirror, unable to resist. Something in its reflection seemed off, as if it captured more than just the room. As my flashlight scanned over it, I glimpsed the faint outline of someone standing just behind me, a shadow, slight and unmoving. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty doorway and the deep silence of the asylum. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned back to the mirror, but now it only reflected the empty room. I felt a pang of unease, the sensation that whatever I had seen was not gone, just waiting, watching from some hidden corner, biding its time. I flipped to another entry in the diary, the words etched faintly, but clear enough. I see myself in the mirror, but something isn't right. It watches, it waits, just beyond the glass. I feel its breath against my skin, its fingers just an inch away, but I cannot touch it. It mirrors me, but it is not me. I felt a chill run through me as I reread those words, the strange sense that the diary was describing not just its writer's experiences, but my own. The mirror was still, its surface dull and lifeless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding there, waiting for the moment I would look away. I stepped back, my foot hitting something solid. Looking down, I saw an old, leather-bound notebook, a second journal, separate from the diary in my hands. I picked it up, noticing that it was surprisingly intact, its pages filled with hurried handwriting. I opened it to a random entry, reading by flashlight. The mirrors show what we cannot see, the reflections we leave behind. Once you enter, it holds you, takes you, piece by piece, until all that remains is your shadow. The words were cryptic, unsettling. I glanced back at the cracked mirror, my flashlight flickering over its dusty surface. The air felt stifling, charged with a kind of energy that twisted my insides, filling me with a terror I couldn't name. But I had to keep moving. I turned to leave the room, but as I stepped toward the door, it slammed shut, the sound echoing through the narrow hallways. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my hand instinctively tightening around the two journals. The flashlight shook in my hand, casting trembling shadows across the walls as I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. In the silence that followed, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound, like whispering, murmurs filtering through the walls. I strained to hear, to make out words, but they were just out of reach, a faint, ceaseless murmur that grew louder the longer I listened. Trapped, I felt the walls pressing closer, the room tightening around me. I looked down at the second journal, and another entry caught my eye. They are here, in every corner, in every wall. The whispers, the shadows, they linger, they wait. You can hear them, if you listen, if you dare. The whispering grew louder, an indecipherable hum that crawled into my ears, pressing against my mind. I stumbled back from the door, pressing my hands over my ears to block it out. But the sound was inside, threading through my thoughts, sinking deeper. The whispering crescendoed, filling every corner of the room, every crevice in the walls, spilling into my mind like dark water. It was everywhere, around me, beneath me, inside me. My hands pressed to my ears, but it was no use. The voices wove their way into my thoughts, a litany of words I couldn't decipher yet instinctively feared. I was suddenly aware of the walls around me, closing in, pressing so close I could barely move. The cracked mirror on the far wall seemed to loom, distorted, like a mouth on the verge of speech. I took a shaky step back, gripping the two journals as if they were anchors in the storm of whispers and shadows. I tried to breathe, to remember where I was, who I was, to remind myself that this was just an old building with nothing but ghosts of memory inside. But as I stood there, paralyzed, I became aware of a presence, something not quite visible yet undeniably real, watching me. I felt it from every shadow, every corner I could not see, as if the walls themselves were staring back. The diary in my hands grew heavier, its pages practically vibrating as if trying to break free. My eyes drifted to one last entry, scribbled at the bottom of the page, barely legible. It read, "When the door closes, and the final line is written, there is no turning back. They say he never left. I hope I am wrong." The words seared into my mind as the door swung open on its own, the hallway beyond stretching into darkness. The whispers quieted for a moment, and I felt a strange compulsion to step forward, to leave the room. I held my breath, the air in my lungs heavy with dread, and crossed the threshold. I moved through the corridor, each step slow, measured, my ears straining for any sign of life, any hint that I was alone, or that I wasn't. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure at the end of the hall. But as I blinked, it vanished, leaving me questioning whether I had seen it at all. I reached the main entrance, the cold air spilling in from the broken windows, but the door was shut tight. I turned the knob, pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Panic seeped in, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think. I retraced my steps, passing empty rooms, the stillness around me deepening with each step. It was as if the building itself were swallowing me, absorbing every sound, every thought, until I felt like I was sinking into its very foundations. Back at the center of the corridor, the diary and journal grew heavy in my hands. I opened them both, pages fluttering, each entry now blurring with the words of the other, as if both authors were one and the same. The final entry read, "I follow in his footsteps, step by step, shadow by shadow, knowing I am not the first and will not be the last. It is only a matter of time." I looked up, my heartbeat loud in the silence, and there, at the end of the hallway, I saw him. A figure stood, barely visible, cloaked in darkness. His head was bowed, his stance a mirror of my own. I took a step forward, and he matched it. Another step, and so did he. My flashlight blinked, and in that brief darkness, I felt his breath near me, cold and close. I ran, my footsteps pounding against the floors, echoing, racing, but the hallways twisted, narrowing, closing in. Every corner, every turn brought me back to the same corridor, the same dim light, the same figure waiting at the end. The walls closed tighter, the air thickening, suffocating. And the last line of the diary echoed in my mind, "There is no way out." The flashlight flickered one last time and died. In the pitch darkness, I heard my own breath, my heartbeat, the rustling of the pages. And, just before everything went silent, I heard the softest whisper right behind me, a voice, calm and knowing, saying my name. I dropped the diaries. The final sound was the echo of them hitting the ground, and then nothing. When my viewers watch the video, perhaps they'll hear the whispers, too, as if the voices are reaching through the screen. As the footage ends abruptly, the last frame lingering on the empty hallway, one question will remain: am I still here, somewhere in those walls, waiting?